the Ellipse from Patek Philippe. As soon as we uploaded it to our website, it is already sold in the same moment. Demand has risen steadily over the last few years, and I'm pretty sure it will continue to do so. Yet for many watch fans out there, it is a very simple, or in the worst case, boring watch. And friends of mine who have nothing to do with watches even refer them to as grandpa watches. For me, it's the contrary. No gimmicks, just purity and beauty expressed through simple design. You might think it would be easy to design a watch that only tells the time and is operated with just two hands. After all, there are no other functions or displays to worry about. But on the contrary, the design is even more difficult than with a complicated watch, as there is no way to hide behind fancy designs. The Ellipse is one of those design pieces that no one whose heart beats for classic vintage watches can ignore. Today you will learn everything there is to know about this classic. Here you can see a wonderful example from the 70s. The reference 3748/1 is made of 18K yellow gold and measures 27 mm without the crown, 32 mm from lug to lug and 17.5 between the lugs. In combination with its absolutely slim high of 5.8 mm, the golden Ellipse is the perfect companion for formal occasions, as it slips easily under the cuff of a dress. The elegant, elliptical shape allows the watch to be worn comfortably and discreetly on the wrist. Under the hood beats a hand-wound caliber 215 and was introduced as a successor to the classic Patek Philippe Calatrava caliber 12-120. But what really gets me about this watch is the deep blue dial. It was something no one had ever seen before. 18 karat blue gold. Blue gold without simply applying color, so to speak. Rather, the composition of the gold was changed. In the early 1960s, Patek began to test the limits of modern chemistry by changing the nature of gold itself. The company experimented tirelessly with all types of gold until it actually created something new. 18 karat blue gold. Patek achieved this with the help of the dial manufacturer Singer, who developed a vacuum coating system in which cobalt and 24 karat gold are vaporized and then condensed onto the 18 karat gold dial. Sounds pretty complicated, and it was. Another interesting term is the O Swiss O imprint at the bottom of the dial, which is often found on ellipses. These small markings are the lowercase Greek letter sigma, and these dials are aptly named sigma dials. It means that all parts, so the dial itself, the hour markers and also the hands of the dial, are made of pure gold. So there were only a few watchmakers who were members of the so-called Association pour la promotion industrielle de l'or, an industry association for the manufacture of gold watches, which explains why sigma dials are not found on all brands. So you can see from the montage of these reels, we have sold a number of stunning ellipses over the years. Dials in various shades of blue, silver, white, gold, and even enamel dials. Models on classic leather straps, but also pieces with precious metal bracelets in white and yellow gold, which came in all shapes and designs you can imagine. The Ellipse was launched back in 1968, and despite the simple Ellipse design, there were already over 65 different versions of the Ellipse on the market in the 70s. A land of milk and honey for every vintage watch collector. This picture from Monochrome Watches is probably the best overview of the 55-year history of the Patek Philippe Ellipse. A single design and yet so much variety. But what really sets the Golden Ellipse apart is its unique elliptical, not quite round, not quite rectangular shape. Although the market had already seen something similar by the end of the 1960s, more on that later, it was Patek that introduced this design to the masses. When it was launched back in 1968, its divine proportions immediately made it an icon in a changing world. The watch industry was on the brink of its own revolution, as the quartz watch was just around the corner. And unlike many other brands, Patek was probably aware of the potential impact. The brand needed a new watch design that was both instantly recognizable as a Patek and unisex. The company also needed a watch that represented true luxury, that could be distinguished from any other watch at first glance. In my opinion, they achieved this goal 100%. But who was responsible for the golden ellipse design? There has been much debate about this in the past decades. The ellipse was designed by Gerald Genta for Patek Philippe. Although we can find several sources that link these three pieces of information, design, designer and manufacturer, this sentence is actually incorrect. But none other than Gerald Genta himself answered the question about the origin of the ellipse in an interview in 2009. Patek Philippe made the ellipse with Rubelli, or Rubelli, I don't know how to pronounce it. In other words, the first point is quickly clarified. It is not a Genta, but a design by Jean-Daniel Rubelli. He was then chef de création, the head of the research and development department at Patek, and designed the ellipse in 1966. Interestingly, he himself attributed the design to a man like Genta. If Genta had not existed, I would never have had the idea of designing the ellipse. So we can say it is not completely unreasonable to associate Genta with the ellipse, especially since Patek rarely discloses information about people who have worked on designs. Another interesting piece of information is that Mr. Rubelli was not only the designer of the ellipse, but also drew it for, drumroll, Audemars Piguet. This information also comes from Mr. Genta himself. It is true that watches resembling the ellipse were first designed by Rubelli himself for Audemars Piguet. Here you can see a comparison of the two models from the late 1960s that have most of the details in common. Audemars Piguet's reference 5313, seen on the left, and Patek Philippe's reference 3548 on the right. Don't get me wrong, Patek's ellipse was an original and distinct design. The way the deep ellipse blue was applied to the dial was a groundbreaking innovation. However, the design did not fall from the sky, but is a result of an evolution of oval watch shapes. So since Mr. Rubelli also worked for Audemars Piguet, let's first take a deeper look at AP's oval watches. In this collage you can see the evolution of Audemars Piguet's oval ellipse dress watches from the early 60s to the late 1970s. As you can see, the shape of these pieces has clearly changed over the years. The first examples from around the 1960s can certainly be described as oval and not the classic rounded rectangle that from Patek Philippe ellipse represents. Towards the end of the 60s, however, the AP models reached the ellipse-like design stage. These are possibly the pieces that Gerald Genta attributed to Mr. Rubelli's work at AP. If we now compare the two designs from 1968, it becomes clear how easy it is to confuse one with the other. The differences only become clear when you look at them side by side. It is the upper apex that is shorter on the AP version and makes it appear slightly more egg-shaped than the Patek version. The way AP used case, bezel, dial and bracelet was much more varied than Patek Philippe. And there you have it, a funky dress watch from the early 1990s with an opaline dial. Frankly, we're talking about shapes here. After all, it is neither right nor wrong to pretend that Audemars Piguet or Patek Philippe had a prerogative or even a patent on case shapes. Besides, the 1960s and 70s were generally a very experimental era when it comes to imaginative case shapes. Nevertheless, I think it's an interesting question to investigate this rabbit hole further and see if we can find the first oval wristwatch. And I would argue that this prize goes to Cartier. La Maison launched its Bengois, French for best tube, collection in 1957. And by the way, did you know that this collection was inspired by an unnamed design from 1912? This makes the Cartier design probably the last common ancestor of the Ellipse models from Patek and Audemars Piguet. So let's come to the conclusion. What is so special about the Patek Philippe Ellipse? Firstly, it was designed by Mr. Rubely, not Mr. Genta. It is a very Genta-like design, but it did not emerge from his sketchbook. Secondly, Rubely designed the first Ellipse for Audemars Piguet and not for Patek Philippe. And finally, AP was not the very first either, as design in general is a long process of inspiration. And if we want to trace it back to the very first time, we might have to go to Cartier in 1912. You can see a direct comparison between Patek Philippe and Audemars Piguet ellipses. Very similar and at the same time very different. However, we should not forget that Patek Philippe's ellipse was revolutionary and groundbreaking in many ways, from the colorway of the dial to the way which the collaboration between the watchmaker and the case manufacturer was organized. So the historical significance of the ellipse lies not in the design, but in the way it influenced the watchmaking process itself. And of course, we need to explain that in more detail in future. But if you want to remember just one detail about the ellipse, it is this sentence. Mr. Jean-Daniel Rubely originally designed the ellipse for Audemars Piguet. So that's it. We hope you enjoyed our video today and picked up some new info you've never heard before. Have a great day and we hope to see you again in our next video.